going to be once again in the Gospel of Luke this morning, chapter 2, the first 7 verses. A familiar text, but one that I hope that we can illuminate for you this morning. By way of introduction, I want you to think about nativity sets. We got a couple up in here. We've got a few more scattered around the church. We got quite a few. They come in all shapes and sizes, do they not? From the miniature tabletop ones to ginormous sized ones. They can be made of many different things, a variety of plastics and wood and other things. Some of them are relatively cheap, and some of them are very expensive. There are even live nativities of people acting and reenacting out today's text. See, when a story is this familiar, we've got two places to look for wisdom in it. One of which is the accepted truths that we all already know. We can remind ourselves of those and keep them close to our hearts. And the other may be in the details that you might not have noticed before. And I hope that we can illuminate a little bit of both of those. So let's begin in the first 3 verses of chapter 2 of the Gospel of Luke. It says, "In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to his own town to register." So our text begins this morning talking about the days of Caesar Augustus, and that time is known affectionately as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It was the reign of Augustus from 27 BC to 14 AD that was a time of relative peace and prosperity throughout the empire. The efficiency of the Romans as overlords, and they certainly were efficient at it, didn't automatically make them loved, but it certainly helped promote trade and travel. They built roads, they built aqueducts, they built bridges, many of which still survive to this day as a testament to their skill. And they also suppressed bandits and pirates that used to infest the areas in between cities. But every government, especially one undertaking such tasks, needs taxes. They need revenue in order to operate. And if you're going to have taxes, you need to have a census. How else can a government know how much revenue to expect and whether or not it's really being collected properly if they don't know how many people live in a given area? So this census for taxation would not have been unique. Most people living in this time would have undergone a variety of censuses over their lifetime. This particular one would have remained obscure and unknown by history if not for the birth of a child that himself would one day change history. A birth in a small, out-of-the-way province called Judea. We are told that everyone went to his hometown to register. This would have been less of an inconvenience in the first century than it is today. Most people didn't travel more than a few miles from where they were born, and few people actually moved away from their hometown. The exceptions, of course, being people who were merchants or soldiers or pilgrims, like those Jews who went to Jerusalem on a regular basis, and certainly nomadic peoples. If I ask that question here today, anybody have a problem with walking to their hometown? I think we have a little more of an issue. I know myself it would be about 400 miles, and Nicole's got to add another 250 to that, and Aaliyah's got a ways to go, and some of you probably might have even more. So it would be a big deal. They, however, lived in a tribal society, a society where your familial connections mattered the most. So it was only natural for the Romans to organize people by their clans, to have people go back and be listed with their relatives. So here we have the journey that you're all familiar with, verses 4 and 5. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. So here we have the journey from Nazareth in the north in Galilee to Bethlehem in Judea. It makes me wonder what sent Joseph, or one of his ancestors, we're not told, moving away from the hill country around Bethlehem to the same kind of hill country up near Nazareth. We know that when Jesus was left behind at the temple later on, that Mary and Joseph were traveling with a bunch of relatives. So Joseph wasn't the only one of his kin, of his family, that moved to Nazareth. At some point it made sense for one of them, or many of them, to move away from their ancestral hometown, from where their people came from. They were searching for something, a better life, an opportunity, and they ended up in Nazareth. Both Nazareth and Bethlehem are small towns, small out-of-the-way towns where shepherding would have been a significant occupation there in the hills. Bethlehem was 5 miles south of Jerusalem, so just outside of the most important city in Israel. But Nazareth was 50 miles to the north, far removed from the epicenter of Jewish culture and life that revolved around the temple. Now we know from our text last week that Mary was with Elizabeth, not far from Bethlehem actually, until about midway through her pregnancy. Perhaps Joseph traveled with her on that journey. It wouldn't have been hard for a carpenter to find odd jobs wherever he went. And then perhaps they simply went to Bethlehem from there and made that short trip. Or maybe Joseph met Mary at Elizabeth's after she was done with the birth of John, and then they journeyed together down to Bethlehem. We don't know the details. However it happened, we know that the two of them end up in Bethlehem about 6 months after the birth of John. We're told that they went to the town of David, and we're familiar with David. He's famous. Bethlehem didn't have much to make it significant, except for that one important period of Jewish history where we hear about Bethlehem. Because Bethlehem was the hometown of the most revered king in Israelite history. Their version of George Washington, their hero that they all revered and speak well of. So it was the starting place for anyone who hoped to resurrect that line, for anyone who hoped to bring that line back into fruition. Anyone who wanted to claim the throne once more had to begin in Bethlehem. It was symbolically important. And we know that Joseph was a distant descendant, a direct descendant, of David. That's significant because God made some very serious promises to David in 2 Samuel. That his line would never fail, that the throne of Israel would belong to his house forever. Now the only semblance of a king that Israel has at this time is that unwanted foreign pretender that I've mentioned a few times. You know who he is, Herod. That's no king. The promise remains, though, in the minds of the people. The throne of David remains distressingly vacant. Everybody knows that. They are waiting. They are waiting for someone with a right to claim the throne, who also has the might to take it and to keep it. But we hear another interesting fact in this. Mary is pledged to be married to Joseph and with child. Now these two things are not supposed to go together in their culture. This was not a society that looked the other way regarding premarital or extramarital sexuality. Such things still happen, as they do in every society, whether or not it's condoned or not. But there was a strong cultural as well as religious taboo against such things. Something even a great king like David learned the hard way. His infidelity nearly destroyed him when it brought forth both the prophet's condemnation and God's wrath against David. So as far as we can tell, the sending of the child before the marriage actually took place was to make it clear that make it clear to everybody, both to Mary and Joseph and to future generations, that this child's real father was not Joseph, but at the cost of a cultural shame from those who knew nothing of Gabriel's announcement. And as I mentioned when we talked about that announcement, it's not as if Mary could say, I'm not pregnant by Joseph, an angel came and told me. That wasn't going to fly. So they're dealing with that situation as well. Verses 6 and 7. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. Here we have the very simply stated birth of the Christ child. The time came for the baby to be born. You know, people often speculate. Are there any coincidences in this world? Or is every single little thing that happens actually part of the providence of God? That is an interesting thought and a question for another time, but one that reminds us that it was no coincidence that Mary's pregnancy came to full term while they were still in Bethlehem and before they were to go home. Bethlehem had to be the birthplace of the Messiah for two very important reasons. Number one, it was the birthplace of David, and symbolism like that matters. And number two, it was what the prophet Micah had predicted years before. Micah 5:2 says this, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times." See, it doesn't really matter to us what state or what city our leaders were born in. Maybe it's a little local pride if the president comes from Pennsylvania or something, but other than that, we don't care. We don't really care where they came from. But it mattered to the people of Israel. They would not have accepted a Messiah from any other town. They didn't want just a liberator to get behind. They wanted a Davidic Messiah, which explains the hesitation later on as Jesus begins his ministry from the people who knew that he grew up in Nazareth, but didn't know that he was born in Bethlehem. We are told that she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. And with those simple words, thus begins the greatest endeavor of God since the creation of the universe. The moment when God stepped into his creation. His past attempts to redeem humanity from the outside, from without, they failed. Human depravity runs too deep. True obedience, and that is necessary for a holy God. True obedience is not possible without a fundamental change in human nature. So the reason behind the incarnation, the dwelling of God with man, is clear. We know why Jesus had to come. A hands-on approach was needed. But have you ever wondered, why did he bother with this natural process of birth? Why didn't Jesus just show up one day, 26 years old in full manhood, and say, "Here I am," and start his ministry? Why did he go through all of that? Let me give you the short answer. It was necessary. The slightly longer answer is this. The process of Jesus entering this world just like us, growing up and living like us, ensured that his eventual sacrifice, that the sacrifice of the Messiah would be 100% authentic. There was no room to think of it as a gimmick or a trick, something that God did that wasn't real. Jesus was a real man undergoing real suffering and actually dying. And that authenticity began in Bethlehem with a child who on the surface appeared as any other, yet contained within that fragile body the very Word of God, the only begotten Son of the Father. Where does Mary do? She wraps him in cloths and places him in a manger. Now that first part was what they did back then. There was nothing special about wrapping him in cloths, though some translations call them swaddling clothes. We're familiar with that term. Although you would think that if he had been born a king in a palace, the cloth might have been nicer, might have been silk, instead of whatever they had to work with. But uncounted millions had entered the world this way since Adam and Eve. Child after child after child born in sin, born to die. A process that seemed unbreakable. It's the fate of all men. Everybody is born this way. Everybody dies. There is no exception to this rule. So as Mary looked down on her son, could she have possibly imagined that he would one day break the chains that had mankind bound so tightly in death? Now the manger, as a part of this, is a little bit more rare, I would think. Perhaps Joseph had a really nice handmade cradle sitting back in Nazareth unused that he had made for this occasion. But for now, Jesus is placed in a feeding trough for animals. That's going to have to do. Because there was no room for them in the inn, and everybody knows that part of the story. You see, if you or I saw a no vacancy sign, we're on vacation, we're heading somewhere, no vacancy, big deal. We keep going, we go to the next one. You just drive down the road to the next inn. It's not a big deal at all. It seems, however, that Bethlehem had only one inn, and that wouldn't have been surprising. Back then, people didn't travel as much. Now, with all those people coming back to Bethlehem, everybody who had ever moved away is back for the census. We're not surprised at all that families are having to make do with whatever room, whatever makeshift shelter they can find. But there's a story behind this. It's a reminder to us that Joseph is nobody special, even with his own clan. Even when he goes to his hometown, he's nobody big. Think about that. Nobody was willing to vacate a simple room for a pregnant woman. He didn't mean anything to them. He was just another guy. Hopefully, I wonder, the owner of the barn, or the cave, traditionally says it's a cave, whatever it was, hopefully that guy didn't charge Joseph for staying in his barn for a few days. Let's hope not. Let's think about the implications of this Christmas story a little bit before we wrap it up. The second half of the message will come tomorrow night. Compared to John, we've studied John's birth. Compared to John, this is about as low-key as you could get. The build-up and the anticipation surrounding John's birth, just a few months ago, just a few miles down the road, it far outshines Jesus. Elizabeth had been surrounded by those hoping to see her birth. There probably wasn't anyone with Joseph and Mary, except maybe a midwife. The only anticipation for this birth came from above. Now there still is a choir of angels and some shepherds to come, and we'll get to them soon enough. But it is obvious that the way in which Jesus will be greater than John, and we know he will be. It's not tied up in the fanfare around his birth. It has nothing to do with that. You see, a king has been born. A revival of the Davidic throne is at hand. But it's without the cheering. It's without the crowds. It's without the fancy trappings of royalty that we would expect. You see, a king has indeed been born. But this world has not seen such a king before. And secondly, this is the culmination of the divine plan. We've been studying this for some time. Everything has led up to this moment. From the announcement and the birth of the forerunner of the Messiah, John, to the announcement and the unique conception of the Messiah, everything has been heading in this direction. An elaborate and exact plan that foreshadows the importance of the mission that God has given to Christ. And I think the words of Zechariah just in the last chapter will help illuminate this a little bit. So I'm going to read a couple of his verses 69 to 75. He has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David, as he said through the holy prophets long ago, salvation from our enemies and from the hand of all who hate us, to show mercy to our fathers and to remember his holy covenant, the oath he swore to our father Abraham, to rescue us from the hand of our enemies and to enable us to serve him without fear, in holiness and righteousness before him all our days. Zechariah knew that salvation is at hand from the house of David. He knew that God would rescue his servants from the hands of their enemies. He knew that it was because of God's mercy and because of the covenant of God with Abraham. And then he said something fascinating. A chance to serve God without fear, in holiness and righteousness. Indeed, a change is at hand. This is a seemingly impossible task. The reconciliation of sinful man with a holy God. And yet it rests this morning upon the little shoulders of the babe, lying in a manger, as Joseph and Mary look on in the light of the star shining down